Vladimir Putin has ordered all Russian forces to halt combat operations across all fronts. The announcement comes just before Orthodox Easter, one of the holiest moments in the Russian and Ukrainian Christian calendar, observed this year over the April 11th and 12th weekend. But this is not some open-ended peace gesture. According to the Kremlin, the truce lasts only from 4 p.m. on April 11th until the end of April 12th, roughly 32 hours in total. Zelensky has signaled that Ukraine is prepared to honor the pause as well, noting that he had already floated the idea of an Easter ceasefire earlier through US-mediated channels. For a moment, this sounds like the kind of headline the world has been waiting for. A pause, a truce. Maybe even the first real sign that this war, after more than 4 years, is finally bending toward de-escalation. But it isn't. Because in Ukraine, ceasefires are almost never just about peace. They are about timing, about leverage, about who gets to look restrained while the deeper war keeps moving underneath. And there is a reason this Easter truce feels fragile from the very beginning. Previous ceasefire attempts have repeatedly collapsed within hours, sometimes almost immediately, with both sides accusing each other of violations. That history matters, because when another holiday ceasefire suddenly appears, nobody reads the headline alone. They read the battlefield around it. Just days before this announcement, Zelensky said Ukraine had already proposed an Easter-linked pause through US-mediated channels, only for Russia to answer with more attacks, including Shahed drone strikes and a deadly strike on Odessa. So the ceasefire did not emerge from trust. It did not emerge from a battlefield that was already cooling down. It emerged after Ukraine says Moscow had already rejected the same symbolic logic once and kept the pressure on instead. That should immediately raise the real question. Not whether a ceasefire exists on paper, but what changed. Because the answer may have less to do with Easter itself and more to do with positioning. Russia is not only fighting on the battlefield right now, it is also fighting in Washington, in diplomacy, and in the broader struggle over who gets blamed for prolonging the war. Putin's special envoy, Kirill Dmitriev, is in the United States meeting Trump administration figures to discuss a Ukraine peace agreement and broader US-Russia economic cooperation. And that visit comes just ahead of a key US decision on whether to extend sanctions relief tied to Russian oil transactions. That timing matters, because once Russia has an envoy in Washington talking peace, the value of Russia appearing to offer peace rises dramatically. That is what makes this ceasefire more than a religious gesture. It becomes an image management tool, a diplomatic instrument, a way to tell Washington, Europe, and the wider world, Russia is not the side blocking de-escalation. Russia is the side offering restraint, and in a war where perception runs alongside firepower, that image has value even if the ceasefire is brief, fragile, and ultimately collapses. That alone would be significant. But this is where it gets bigger, because this Easter truce is not landing in the middle of a war that is winding down. It is landing in the middle of a war that is spreading into more layers at once. There is the front line, there is the drone war over cities and infrastructure, there is the economic struggle over oil and energy. And beneath all of that, there is a slower and more dangerous campaign taking shape. A campaign of attrition aimed not just at soldiers, but at systems, at movement, at logistics, at the network that keeps pressure possible in the first place. That is where the bridge story matters. According to reports made public this week, Ukrainian forces had destroyed a Russian-controlled bridge in occupied Kherson Oblast, spanning the Konka, a tributary of the Dnipro River. The operation itself was reportedly carried out in early 2025, but it only became public now. Ukrainian troops reportedly used UK-made Malloy T-150 drones over a 2-month period after earlier attempts using airstrikes and HIMARS failed. Over roughly 30 missions in 60 days, the unit is said to have delivered around 1.5 tons of explosives before a final missile strike brought the bridge down. And that matters, because in this kind of war, a bridge is never just a bridge. A bridge is movement. A bridge is supply. It is one of those quiet pieces of infrastructure that keeps an occupied position alive day after day without ever becoming the headline. So when Ukraine brings one down inside Russian-held territory using drones, it is doing far more than scoring a visual battlefield success. It is attacking the connective tissue of Russian control itself. And that reveals something much bigger about the kind of war Ukraine is now trying to fight. Not a war built only around one dramatic breakthrough at the front, but a war of attrition in a more dangerous form. A war where the goal is to make every Russian position harder to hold, harder to supply, harder to reinforce, and far more expensive to defend. And if Ukraine is widening this attrition war so aggressively, why would Russia want the optics of a ceasefire right now? The first answer is symbolism. Orthodox Easter carries real emotional and political weight across both Russia and Ukraine. Any pause tied to it instantly looks humane, restrained, even moral. But wars this long are never only about symbolism. They are also about timing. Because a ceasefire does more than stop fire on paper. It changes the headline. For a few crucial news cycles, the story stops being about Russia's attacks, Ukraine's drone campaign, infrastructure strikes, and attrition. It becomes about the truce, about who offered it, about who accepted it, about who broke it first. And in a conflict where the information battle runs parallel to the battlefield, that matters enormously. If Russia appears to be the side offering calm, while the broader war remains unresolved, it gains narrative room. And that is where the trap comes into focus. Because a ceasefire like this does not need to produce real peace to be useful. It only needs to produce the appearance of restraint. If Ukraine honors the pause, Moscow still gets the optics of being the side that initiated calm. If Ukraine violates it first, or can be made to look like it did, Moscow gets something almost as useful: the ability to argue that Kyiv, not the Kremlin, blocked de-escalation. In other words, this is not just a military pause, it is a perception weapon. And perception matters even more because Ukraine is entering a season of heavier pressure anyway. Zelensky has already warned that the coming spring and summer months will be difficult, not only on the battlefield, but diplomatically as well. That changes how the ceasefire should be read, because now the truce is not appearing in isolation. It is appearing at the exact moment Ukraine is facing a tighter strategic environment. Military pressure at the front, diplomatic pressure from partners, and economic pressure around the oil war dimension that Kyiv has increasingly used to impose costs on Russia. So the real story may be much worse than the headline suggests. Past ceasefires have taught both sides not to trust the headline. Russia is trying to preserve diplomatic positioning in Washington. Ukraine is widening its war of attrition beyond the trench line and into bridges, routes, and logistics. And Zelensky is warning that the months ahead will be politically and militarily difficult. That is why this Easter truce may not be the beginning of de-escalation at all. It may be a pause announced at the exact moment both sides are trying to shape the next phase before it fully arrives. If Ukraine is no longer just attacking positions, but attacking systems, then the most important target in this next phase may not be a bridge at all. It may be the machinery that funds Russia's war in the first place. Because on April 5th, Ukraine hit Norsy, Russia's fourth largest oil refinery. 2 days later, it was reported that the refinery had suspended operations after the drone strike. That matters, because Norsy is not just another facility. It is part of the industrial bloodstream that helps keep the Russian war machine moving. And once refineries start going down, the war stops being only about soldiers at the front. It becomes about whether the state behind them can keep feeding the machine at the same pace. That is what makes this moment so dangerous to misread. The ceasefire lasts 32 hours. The attrition campaign underneath it does not. While the world watches where the guns go quiet for a day and a half, Ukraine is trying to build a different kind of pressure entirely. One that keeps accumulating after the headlines move on. Bridges, refineries, energy sites, export infrastructure, transport arteries. This is not just about inflicting damage. It is about changing the cost structure of the war. It is about forcing Russia to protect more assets, repair more systems, disperse more resources, and spend more money defending the rear while still trying to keep momentum at the front. And that is where the ceasefire starts looking even less like a peace story and more like a positioning story. Because if Ukraine is widening the war into Russia's logistical and economic depth, Moscow suddenly has even more reason to value optics. A short Easter truce does not solve any of Russia's deeper problems, but it can temporarily change the conversation around them. For a brief window, the international story becomes less about burning refineries and widening attrition, and more about whether Russia offered calm and whether Ukraine honored it. And in a conflict where narrative pressure can influence diplomacy almost as much as battlefield pressure, that shift matters. That is why the timing is so revealing. Dmitriev is in Washington talking peace and broader economic cooperation. A sanctions relief decision tied to Russian oil is sitting on the calendar. Zelensky is warning that the coming months will be difficult, not only militarily, but politically and diplomatically. And right in the middle of that pressure field, Moscow unveils a short ceasefire wrapped in the symbolism of Easter. That does not prove some grand hidden plan all by itself. But it does show that the truce arrives at a moment when the political value of appearing constructive may be unusually high. And that is the real payoff of this story. It is a story about what kind of war can produce a ceasefire like this. A war where symbolism and strategy overlap. A war where a bridge in Kherson and a refinery deep inside Russia matter as much as a trench line on the front. A war where diplomacy in Washington and drone strikes on industrial infrastructure are part of the same pressure system. A war where even a holiday pause can function as both a gesture and a weapon. So yes, Russia announced a ceasefire with Ukraine, but the real story may be much worse. Because the truce does not mean the war is cooling down. It may mean both sides are trying to enter the next phase from a stronger position. Russia with better optics, better diplomatic posture, and a cleaner public narrative. Ukraine with a widening attrition campaign aimed not just at Russian troops, but at the systems that keep the war running. And when those two dynamics collide, what you get is not peace. You get a pause sitting on top of a much bigger struggle over leverage, endurance, and control. So the next time a short truce flashes across the screen as a sign of hope, the real question may not be whether the guns have fallen silent. The real question may be what is still moving underneath that silence. Because in Ukraine, the war does not only live at the front, it lives in the roots. It lives in the bridges. It lives in the refineries. It lives in the diplomatic rooms far from the battlefield. And right now, all of those layers are moving at once. That is why this Easter ceasefire may end up being remembered not as the beginning of peace, but as the moment the war's deeper logic became harder to ignore.